Okay, so it's Tuesday, August 7, 2018. This is Leyla Vural interviewing Rick Landman at the CBST Synagogue in Manhattan for the Stonewall Oral History Project. Thank you.
Okay, I think the best place to start is back in June of 1952 on Father's Day. I was born in Queens, New York. And the first sounds that I heard is a father who sounded just like this here. My father was a refugee, a Jewish German refugee from World War II, from the Holocaust. And now looking back at my life, to start off this idea of the history, I want you to really understand where I'm coming from. I am a child of two German Jewish refugees, and that really colored so much of my life. Growing up, I grew up in Queens in a segregated neighborhood. Back in 1952, that's before Brown versus Board of Education, Jews lived on my block. It was the Jewish block. But I was the only one whose parents had accents, or my father. Everyone else, their grandparents had Yiddish accents. They came over much earlier in the 1900s. My family, those who survived, got here in 1939. And only on my father's side, my grandmother and grandfather and the three children survived. The siblings, my great-grandparents, they all died. So I grew up with a very small family in a very sheltered neighborhood. I thought the entire world was Jewish until I started to go beyond my elementary school. And a very important thing happened to me in my fourth year of Hebrew school. Again, I'm born in June. My bar mitzvah was going to be the last Saturday, the last Shabbat in June of 1965. So about 2 months before that, Mr. Rosenberg, the teacher, is showing us the ritual traditions on how Jews get married. So he would take one taller boy, put him up in the corner, and take a girl that's shorter, put next to it. Another tall boy and girl, another tall boy and girl. And then when he comes to me, he goes, "I'm sorry, but there's no girl shorter than you. And we used up all the girls in the class, so you just watch what everyone else is doing." Now, I don't think I said the first thing out loud. I think this was just in my head. I sort of said like, "Ooh, I don't want to marry a girl." I don't think I said that. But what I did do is I raised my hand and I said, "Is there a bracha or a tradition for two boys to get married?" Again, 1965, at the age of 12. So Mr. Rosenberg took me out to the hallway and started, "Never, never, never will two men ever get married. Don't you ever say this again. I'm going to call up your parents and..." So I said to myself, oops, I think I just said something I really shouldn't have. And it's very hard to take back when you walk back into the classroom. But also at that bar mitzvah in June, I was supposed to donate a Torah scroll that my mother's father, who fought in World War I for the Kaiser, brought to America. And I was supposed to donate it to that synagogue in Queens. Well, after he yelled at me like that, I said, "They're not getting the Torah." I said, "One day there'll be a gay synagogue," except I don't think I used the word gay, but there'd be a synagogue where I could maneuver somehow to marry another man and get married. So then, as I said, that June, I'm the valedictorian in my Hebrew school, and later I'll become the valedictorian in my Hebrew high school. I do get bar mitzvahed in the last Saturday, which now is called Gay Pride Shabbat, but mine was 4 years ahead of Stonewall. And then that summer in July is the first time I told my Jewish summer camp counselor, Ira, that I had a crush on Wayne, who was sleeping next to me. So by this point in time, I know I'm gay. I even look at pictures of myself when I'm 7 and I go like, how do people not see this? But in the 1950s, people just thought I was a sweet child, a little kid. So now I go to the next important thing I would say is I graduated high school at 16, and I start the University of Buffalo at 17. And the first person I meet when I get off the taxi cab is this gorgeous senior named Greg. And he is the boyfriend of the woman who was my freshman orientation leader, whatever. And I had a crush on him. And then when I start school, of course, he's a senior and I'm a freshman. I try to bump into him, whatever. And then I'm staying in dorm facilities at the University of Buffalo, but it was in a garden apartment called Allenhurst. And that was the first time I got beaten up for being gay. And of course, when I went to the dorm people and said I'd like to get out of, I don't like being beaten up, they gave me the money back that my parents paid for the dorm tuition. I had a Regent scholarship, so I had tuition free, because back then Queens College was free if you were a city graduate, and if you got a Regent scholarship, you can go to any state school for free. So I took that money and I moved into the attic where Greg was living. It had a little dormer that was like 5'5" tall, so no one else could stand in that dormer but me. So I paid them $25 a month, so I was making money off of my parents giving the money to the dorm, and I was so happy. So now I'm living in college, I'm 17 years old, I never had sex with a guy yet, but by that point in time, I'm telling everybody that I'm gay. So the women next door, there's 5 women, see if I can, Margie, Marsha, Dana, Barbara, and Cindy, and they called it the Women's Collective. And I used to hang out there all the time because by that time, Marsha was Greg's girlfriend. They finally got married and they have kids and grandkids. But I would go there almost every day, and one day they would have readings. So it would be like the feminine mystique or something. So even though I'm a boy, I can read a book. So I'd read the book too, and then I would go and I would talk. And one day a woman named Madeline Davis, who's still alive, she was in charge of, she started the Radical Lesbians. And she was a tough person. And I was there, and she says, "No men allowed." And I said, "Well, I'm a gay man." She says, "I don't care. Go start your own group. Get out of here." So I left, and I said, okay. So I had already I was the bus committee coordinator for the March on Washington against Vietnam from Buffalo, and I was on the intramurals sports groups because I went skiing and stuff like that. So I said, I can go to the Student Association, and I'm very good filling out forms. Now, I couldn't be a lawyer back then because, again, this is before 73. I was mentally ill for being openly gay, and I was a criminal. So, but I always, looking back at my life, I'm always the one that they give the paperwork for, and I fill out the forms. So I filled out a form to start a group with the Student Association, and I called it the Gay Men's Liberation Front. I copied the GLF, but if she wasn't going to let me into her Radical Lesbians, I was going to do just gay men. So I set up the Constitution and everything, but I have no vice president, secretary, or treasurer. It's just, so I go to the first meeting. Everyone knows me and they like me, and I'm sort of comical. So when I stand up and I move, will someone please second the motion? I move that the University of Buffalo create a Gay Men's Liberation Front, and I would like a budget of $800. Everyone was laughing. And then I just got quiet, and I said, no, I'm serious. I'm gay. I want to start a group. Silence. Nothing. And then I just would look at my friends who were sitting there, and then someone says, I second the motion. I said, thank you. I call the question. I would like a vote now. It carried. But the problem is when they came up to me, they said, you have no members. And I said, I don't really know any gay people either. And I was a virgin at the time. So I said, no problem. So I made at that time, we had, I said poster boards with magic markers. So I made a sign, Gay Men's Liberation Front. And we had tables in Norton Union, the student union, and I would set up my table, and I would put up my sign, I'd take my textbook, and I'm sitting there doing my homework, basically, and people would walk by and would giggle and would throw spitball. This is the 1960s. Oh, no, right now we're in early 1970. So a woman called Wendy, don't remember her last name, vaguely remember what she looked like, comes up and says, I'm not a lesbian, I'm a gay woman. Can I join your group? So I said, well, I don't really have any members yet, but the problem is my sign says Gay Men's Liberation Front. You can join if you help me make a new sign. So we made a new sign, and then I became the same exact name as New York City, the Gay Liberation Front, and I amended the Constitution and everything. So she was either the secretary or treasurer or she was a board member of our group. And then it took a week or two or three, more and more people, a guy named Ben, I think his last name is Ben Wallman, he became involved, Michael Hamilton, except he wasn't a student. He hung out enough, it's fine with me. So eventually we had enough people that I cleared the hurdle for the student association, and then they gave me a room, and then they gave me money. So I called up my father and I said, I'm flying in. At that time, student standby was like $15. I have money to create a library. So I went to the Christopher Street bookstore, and I walked in and I said to the guy, I didn't use the whole $800. I have like $300 to buy. So we filled up an entire big carton of soft porn, basically. And I think I had 2 female things, otherwise. And my father then drove me back to LaGuardia, and I went back. So we had a library, and we had the Gay Men's Liberation, but I didn't know exactly what to do. So then I decided we're going to have to raise some more money, and I need more members. So I got on my bicycle, and I rode down to the Hibachi Room, which was the bar in Allentown, lower, like Allen Street. I don't even remember. It just closed this year because the federal government bought it as part of some project or whatever, and then under Trump they didn't renew the lease. So I couldn't really, I don't think, get into the bar yet. So I went to the parking lot, and we had these mimeograph machines with the blue on the white, and I would put behind the windshield wipers a sign that now it's hi, my name is Rick. I'm 17 years old and started a group at UB, and I'm looking for like men to come to our dance. And I think the group was called Rufus that we had, and they had to pay $5 to get in, but any UB student could get in for like either $1 or a quarter or something like that. So I was at the door that day, and that's how I got my membership. So every student that came in became, and then as a result, we actually had a student organization with people in it, and had meetings and consciousness-raising groups and that type of stuff. So then comes June.
Let me ask you a question. How did you, because my understanding is the Gay Liberation Front formed right after Stonewall. Do you remember how you knew about it?
Okay.
And did you know about Stonewall? And if so, what did you think about it?
Okay, when that year that my 16-year-old, when I'm 16, I got a Westinghouse scholarship for medical engineering to go to NYU in the Bronx 1 day a week and take classes. So I think it was Wednesday, I'm not sure. But yeah, I had a bus pass, it was like for a nickel or for free, and a lunch pass. So my parents didn't know this until like 20 years later. The students were going on strike that year at NYU, so I wouldn't cross the picket line. So I did go to one class where they were like dissecting a frog, and it was like, no way am I doing this, but I get free lunch and a free bus pass. So I would go to the Bronx, I would eat lunch, and then I'd go to the Village. And I'd walk around looking for homosexuals, because I looked in the dictionary and I had to figure out, part of this actually deals with the bar mitzvah too. I didn't know what a harlot was. That's my bar mitzvah portion. So at that time when you had to look things up in a dictionary to figure out what you were, I mean, I don't even think gay was really at the time. So I knew homosexuals in the Village. And I knew I was sort of one of them, but I was much younger, and when I was 16, I looked 12. So on the night of Stonewall, I'm getting ready to go to freshman orientation. I do remember hearing something and then reading a little something about it. And then I kept in touch with what was happening in Manhattan, and then we would get literature and stuff in Buffalo that I could read it. So I did, I also did know about the Gay Activists Alliance. And it really wasn't the political difference as much, or the people, Jim Owls versus, it wasn't that. I thought the name sounded a bit pretentious. So I liked the name Gay Liberation Front. I was always a little bit more of the pushing the envelope person, which actually is a little bit more of the actual differentiations between GLF and GAA. But I just liked the name better. So then what happened that June, I came home because school is over, and I heard again that there's going to be a demonstration the last Sunday to commemorate basically police brutality and that Gay Lives Matter kind of thing. And so I was definitely going to go. This is already after going to Washington and protesting the Vietnam War. So I'm pretty used to demonstrations. But I was all by myself. And I do have visual memories of standing in front of Stonewall in that area and seeing all the police on 7th Avenue and being a little bit nervous because I was almost sort of by myself. But then I did see they had this big red, white, and black flag that said Gay Liberation Front. So even back then I felt like a cousin. I'm sort of related. So I hung out with them. And then to my surprise, we didn't walk up 7th Avenue. We started going down Christopher Street the other way, and we went up 6th Avenue. But I'm all by myself. And I don't know those are older people. Some of them are in their 20s and some are in their 30s. So at first, I was walking on the sidewalk because I was afraid of, getting arrested. So I walked from like Christopher Street up to around 14th Street on the sidewalk. And then everyone starts yelling, out of the sidewalks and into the street, out of the sidewalks and into the street. I said, oh, what the hell? So I walked into the street. So now I am actually walking up 6th Avenue in what now is called the first, Pride March or Pride Parade. And I'm getting my own. You see all these other people and people waving, and you're beginning to feel like, So now I'm really feeling my oats, and I'm going from like group to group and walking around and everything. And then we're getting close to Central Park, and I must have opened up my big mouth again. This is the 1970. I'm like just turned 18 years old, and I said something rude to a police officer. You can imagine. And he's such a stereotypical police officer, big, heavy man. And I was much thinner then. And he starts running after me. So I am not an athlete. I don't want to fall and break a nail. So I ran, though. I ran the last 5 blocks. And then I remember jumping up onto the sidewalk at Central Park. They were turning around going, I'm on Parks Department land now. You got to leave me alone. So that was it. And then I think we continued walking up onto the grass, and we had some sort of a rally. So technically I could say I walked with the GLF in the first Pride March, in 1970. But I wasn't really part of them at all. At that time, I really didn't know anyone. And then I do remember also that year getting the $800. What do you do with a check that's written out to Gay Liberation Front? So I do remember distinctly, again, the names of the university buildings are all changed in Buffalo. This was on the old campus by where Bailey and Main Street is. I walked across the green lawn in front of what I called Baird Hall, the music hall, by myself, and I walked to a bank, which I think was like Marine Midland or something of that sort, and then sat down and asked them, how do I open up an account for the Gay Liberation Front? I think back at the chutzpah that I had at that time. So we ended up having a joint account. They wouldn't open up account for Gay Liberation Front. So it was the Richard Landman and care of or whatever, also known as the Gay Liberation Front. So that's how I handled the money, because I did everything efficiently and properly. Did it all with checks. That's where I got how I handled the $800. So I do remember that. So then we had the march in 1970. Then we had, in March 15th of 1971, the first march on Albany for, at that time, gay rights. And this was the first statewide march in the country. And my little group of Gay Liberation Front from Buffalo, but from UB mostly, was one of the organizing groups. Now, there was a group of old men. They were in their upper 20s and 30s in Buffalo, and it was called the Mattachine Society. Now, we had blue jeans, maybe I had penny loafers or sneakers. They wore khaki pants and button-down shirts, and they had jobs, and they were older. So we really didn't intermingle too much. But they had money, and they had cars. And I wanted to go to Albany, and we didn't have money, and we didn't have cars. So, and I know I'm being recorded now, so I'm going to be careful in how I put this. I believe I'm 18 already at this point in time, because it's 1971. And I do remember where he lived in the general neighborhood. He had a house, and I went to visit him in the evening, and he gave me a glass of red wine, and I remember the living room, and I vaguely remember where the TV was and everything, and we got to know each other biblically, sort of. And as a result, after that, I got a ride to Albany. And Mattachine and the GLF in Buffalo were no longer that adverse. We did a lot of things cooperatively to each other, so the groups. So, and then there's another important part that I have to mention, which was, I remember I told you we had male consciousness raising groups. I basically copied the feminist consciousness raising group and my group therapy. At UB, I was so young and so little, and then having this child of Holocaust survivors and then being openly gay, I was good to go to group therapy. So I would go to group therapy personally. But then when I started the organization, so what I did was I was a facilitator. So I had like 3 or 4 groups of like 8 people at a time going on. So I would go the first day, and I would say, I'm just your facilitator. And this is what we're going to do, and these are the rules. And then I'd say, we're going to go around the room, everyone talk about their first sexual experience. And then I'd get up and leave. So it was on Main Street near Winspear, on the 2nd story of a little building. Sam Goldsmith, who's passed away, asked me the question. He said, why are you leaving? Why don't you stay here and answer the question? I go, I'm not in this group. I'm the facilitator. And they said, we're not going to take that crap. When was your first sexual experience? I didn't have one yet. So Sam took me into the back room. So this was February 26, because I remember calling my parents that night, because their anniversary is February 27th. And I spoke to my parents, and I said, remember over Christmas we talked about sex, drugs, and politics? Well, I'd smoked marijuana. I was very politically active, so I said, hey, 3 out of 3. So my father and my mother, I can tell they're not on the same phone. At that time, we had things called extension phones. My mother's in the kitchen, my father's in the bedroom. So I hear them say, can we call you back? You're at home now. Okay. So I said, fine. Oh, no, because also, my father said, do we know her, him, who? So I said, no, it was a him. So I said, and his name is Sam, and he's pre-med. So my father goes to my mother, and you can hear, because I know they're, Lisa, Booby, not so bad. He's Jewish and going to be a doctor. But then we'll call you back. So they call me back, and my father goes, your mother and I never really had a detailed discussion on our lives, because neither of us had any homosexual anything. We don't even have homosexual friends. But we wanted to talk. And your mother, my mother first thought it was a phase type of thing, although they've known about it for a long time. They figured eventually I'd grow out of it. But now here's the conversation. I'm not growing out of it, I'm consummating it. So my father goes, Ricky, let me tell you, when I was your age, I'd come home from school. I'd be afraid that the kids across the street would beat me up. I'd come home and I'd say to my mother, what did the Jews do? Why do they hate us so much? And he goes, my mother said to me, the guys are wrong, The priests are wrong. Your teacher's wrong. The Führer's wrong. The Jews did nothing wrong. The whole world is wrong. But you have to love yourself and realize that there's nothing wrong with you. So he goes, Ricky, they say homosexuals are no good and they're sick and they're this and they're that. The whole world is wrong. You're still my Ricky. So, when I think back to how does a 17-year-old have the courage to do this, it's because my parents were supportive. And that talk of how you're still my son, and so you're I don't know if you use gay, so you're homosexual. You're still my son. So that, and then of course, typical my father, and he goes, and you and your mother, you both lost your virginity, only one day apart, but different year, because it was their 25th or so wedding anniversary. So, could have been around 25th, because my brother's older than me. So, again, it was humor, it was support, and I knew that my parents were behind me. So, another reason I wanted to really explain it to them that night is because I said to them, in 2 weeks or so, I'm going to Albany for a march on gay rights, and in case I get my picture in the paper, I want you to at least to be prepared, because it was the New York Post. But back then, the New York Post wasn't as bad as the Daily News. The Post was the middle paper. The Times was the best, and then it was the Post. So there is a picture of me somewhere, I think, in the Post, tiny, standing up on the Capitol. We turned our hands, we did the limp wrist. I mean, the other people, a bunch of us. So there is a picture of me somewhere, I believe, with a limp wrist on one of the steps of the buildings in Albany. And at least my parents then were prepared for the fact, when it started going through the neighborhood even more, that Ricky's gay. So my little group went to Albany, and so that's 71. So now comes 73, and I'm going to graduate with my bachelor's degree, which is a long story dealing with the draft and everything, but I'll leave. You can read my memoirs on that. But we had our party for the Gay Liberation Front annual dance, and this one guy came up and was flirting with me at the door. I handled the money and stuff at the door. And he came on to me, and then he said, "You want to come back to my dorm room on the 9th floor afterwards? We'll smoke some dope and fool around." And I said, "Sure." And then when I got there, I heard him yell out, "He's here." And all the doors opened up. And probably less than a dozen guys came out, and they started kicking me and beating me and spitting on me and trying to grope me, and it wasn't very nice. And then my friend on the 8th floor, who knew that this was happening, but not to me, came up to sort of see who was being fag bashed. And then when he saw it was me, he at least stopped the fight and picked me up and carried me to the infirmary and kept on apologizing for his, because these were all guys of his friends, part of the wrestling team at UB, who set me up. And of course, years later, you find out half the people who set me up and beat me up were closet queens in themselves. But so that was 1973, and
Stop just for a second.
oh, the man's vacuuming.
Also, let's go back to your childhood a little bit before you go on to after
Okay.
college.
Well, I'm at the 73 already.
You are, I know. So I want to ask you a little bit more before you talk about after college, about when you were a child. Do you remember how you thought about yourself and how comfortable you were in yourself and how you kind of fit into the neighborhood and the social world as a child, and how you then started to think, oh, using the word of the time, like, oh, I'm a homosexual. Do you remember that about yourself?
I always knew I was smaller. So like whenever we had a class picture, I'm in the front holding the sign. I also have vivid memories of going to the day camp before I went to sleepaway. And I went to sleepaway at 9. So we're talking about 6, 7, 8, around that time, not wanting to get undressed in front of the other kids. So my counselor had to bring me into his dressing room, and I got undressed in front of the counselor. So I knew at that time I was sort of attracted to men. I only had girlfriends because the boys wouldn't play with me. Number one, I was the youngest of the baby boomers. Again, I'm born in 52, my brother's born in 49. After the war, I'm already trickling down. But there was Lainey and Karen and Joni and Amy. They were more the people who I played with. And then one guy, Ira, who was like 5 years younger than me. So the other kids who were a little bit older than me, my brother's age, the only time that they would ever call my name, it'd be, Ricky, the ball ran under the car. You're the only one little enough. Can you go and get the ball and then give it back? We don't want to play with you. So I grew up I went to summer camp from 9 years old. I was always afraid because I threw like a heterosexual girl. And I never really had experience in any of this stuff. But the wonderful thing of this, not having any friends in elementary school, junior high school, I studied. That was it. So I was valedictorian type of thing. So I had wonderful learning skills. I think I was 13th in the city of New York on the Regents Scholarship exam. So I always did good in school, which is why I have 3 master's degrees and a JD and tons of continuing education certificates. And if I need to know something, I can learn it. So it was basically because in those early days, 1, college was free, and 2, I had a very good specifically segregated education system. K through 12, I was in what was called the Special Progress Track, SP. That's how come I graduated at 16. So I took 3 years of school in 2 years. And my class was kept together. So my neighborhood was all pale-skinned. The word white to me is very interchangeable depending upon what era you were. Sometimes Jews are white, sometimes Jews are not. Sometimes Irish is white, sometimes Irish is not. So I didn't want to call them white people because my neighborhood was mostly Italian, Jewish, and Irish, but no people of color. And then when you went from the elementary school, which Robert Mapplethorpe went to, we then went to the junior high school where Joe D'Alessandro went to, and I had a crush on him, and he used to make believe I was a piece of mail and tried to throw me in the mailbox, but you'll have to read my book on that one. And then even I went to a high school which had 6,000 students, predominantly students of color. But because I was in a special track, only in one class, in Mr. Butler's social studies class, like in 10th or 11th grade, one girl, Alexis Frazier, I still remember these names, was African American. Otherwise, every other teacher, every other student through K through 12 were the same people who basically were funneled from my elementary school. But the other interesting thing is, I think the teachers knew I was gay because I never had to take gym. So it was always, first of all, I was tiny and very young and very, I call it sissy-gendered. I was not flamboyant, but demonstrative. So I think the teachers must have realized that, and the idea of sending me down to I've never even seen the locker room, to send me down to the locker room to change and to do this type of stuff, no way. So I was always the monitor who sat in the front with the Delaney cards, and if you didn't have your sneakers, I was supposed to or if you were absent, I was supposed to give you a mark. But if you were really hot and cute, and you were my friend, sometimes I forgot to give you the mark. But as a result, I never had to like climb those ropes and bring in I never did gym. And so I said, I think that was because the teachers probably sort of sensed that. So.
Do you remember that you kind of knew you could trust your parents?
Well, again, I did not tell my parents when I was 13 that I was gay. I started broaching and I did ask a girl in the 6th grade to go to the prom, but she turned me down, so that's it. And then after that, I didn't even ask. Oh, no, I did go with Rita Menschel, who's still my friend today. My brother had tickets to see Diana Ross and the Supremes at Westbury, and the other couple dropped out. So my mother says, well, take Ricky. And my brother goes, well, not unless he has a date. So my brother and his girlfriend, who was now his wife for like 48 years, I had to ask a girl to double date with my brother. So Rita, who was in my AP physics class, sat next to me. So I asked her, and we went. And it was abysmal. I didn't know she was kosher, and my sister-in-law wanted to go for Chinese food afterwards. I didn't know why she didn't want to eat anything. And I think I liked Diana Ross and was singing the songs more than she was. So, but we're still friends, and she's in the book. So she was the only girlfriend I ever dated in school. And I always had a date, though. You had to date a girl in summer camp. Because if you had a girlfriend on also Wednesday nights, you could go to town to the movies. If you didn't have a girlfriend, you had to stay in the canteen on camp so I always had a girlfriend. And I usually picked the girlfriend's sister was my brother's girlfriend, which had advantages because Zena was in charge of the waterfront and I didn't know how to swim. I did not, the water was cold and they had fish in it and I didn't know what the fish were doing. So I really didn't like swimming. But when your girlfriend's sister's the waterfront counselor, she said, jump in and just tread water a little bit, try to get to the raft. And then you can hold on and take your time. You're not supposed to, you're supposed to do that. And then get to the next raft. And then get rafts in there and then come back. So I finally passed the deep water test. I was like the only senior that was still in what they called the crib, until I dated the sister of the swimming counselor. Manipulation was something I was good at. So Carol was my girlfriend, and the problem was when we went on overnight raids to the girls' bunks, I tried to play cards with her. I wasn't going to make out with her. So I felt really sort of bad to it. Well, every year if I had a girlfriend, we really didn't do anything. But I have a feeling that the guys who said they were doing things, and we were talking about 9, 10, 11, and 12, they weren't doing anything either. They were just being much more boisterous, or maybe they copped a feel or something like that. But I played cards. I was always very good at doing things like that. So as I said, I knew I was gay. I also, I only became academic in 6th grade when I actually had a gay teacher, and he sort of changed my life. In 5th grade, I was an artistic student. I was in the artistic track. And we actually had this school had like a cart with paintbrushes and stuff, and my teacher, we would go to the other classrooms with the younger kids, and that's because we didn't have like a special art program, and I remember doing that. So I actually would draw what we would now call pornographic pictures at home myself, and then rip them up into tiny little pieces so no one could ever see them, because I wasn't sure what boys did with each other. So, and I never saw a stag movie. I never bought a porno movie. We didn't have computers. So I envisioned myself what people would be doing, and then I would rip it up. So as I said, yes, as a child, I always knew I was different. I always knew I was gay. And then, as I said, I started verbalizing it at the age of 12 and 13. But there's a picture of me, which I have coming out of the swimming pool at the Pine Hill Arms in the Catskill. And I can still remember Grandma with her brownie camera, and she said, like, smile. And I kicked my foot back, and I looked like, one of the swimming divas coming out of the pool. And when I look at that picture, that's the picture I showed to my parents 10 years ago, and I said, how did you not know? But again, they said, we thought you were sweet. So as I said, I had a happy childhood. It was sheltered. I didn't also know that much about the horrors that happened to to my parents and to my family. At 13, I do remember asking my dad, how come no relatives are coming to my bar mitzvah? Everyone else had a big party out at Leonard's and stuff on the island. And here I am, valedictorian, and I have like no relatives coming. So my father goes down and brings up a suitcase and opens up and takes out a picture. And he goes, you see these people? This is all your family. They would have loved to come to your bar mitzvah, but they did not get out. So I do remember those words at the age of 13. That's all that they told me, and that's all I really wanted to hear. In my mind, I did not envision Auschwitz, Theresienstadt. Somehow, I guess I just visited, they're still over there someplace. They didn't come out. I mean, of course, years later, I would joke about things and say, like, I came out early because I was afraid you didn't get out. And again, in my life, there are a lot of analogies between being Jewish in the Nazi era and being gay in different aspects. Not the same, but there are some similarities, and I felt like a Marrano Jew being a Marrano gay person, where you had to hide things and you couldn't be yourself. There's just, again, in my memoirs, I go back and forth, and that the two things that seem to be related in my life. But then getting back to the male consciousness raising group, so it was on that night that I met Sam Goldsmith and had my first relationship, and then the next month was the March on Albany. 73 is when I got beaten up, but then graduation was the next week, and my parents came up for my bachelor's graduation, and I took pancake makeup and I put it on my face because they kicked me in my face and I was pretty black and blue. And I do remember my father going like this and asking what it was. And of course, at that time, I wore red nail polish when I went to the draft board when I was 18. I was much more, so I said, oh, Dad, it's because I'm gay. But my dad died 3 years ago at 94 and a half. And around 92, 93, I had discussions with him, and I would sort of say, like, how come you never came to my, you were a soldier in the army, you survived concentration camp. And he said, wait a minute, did you ever tell me you were raped twice and beaten 4 times? And then all of a sudden it hit me. I was embarrassed that I was beaten up. The police and the school both said it was my fault. Boys will be boys. You shouldn't have started the Gay Liberation Front. What do you expect from these guys? I didn't tell my parents. And when they came up for graduation, I didn't tell them I was just beaten. So it took me 60 years until I realized, again, as a little tough cookie, you don't want, I've been protecting my parents. I think most children of Holocaust survivors, when you grow up, most children of immigrants, you develop, because you speak English better sometimes, and you develop the ability, no wonder I'm a lawyer, So all my life, I always protect other people, but for myself. So my father and I, that's the first time we actually hugged after that. And my father said he would have said something. But, at that time, the only person who came to my aid was one of my teachers who took me to her divorce attorney. She had married a man who turned out being gay. And the divorce attorney got a protective order against the 9 guys who beat me up. And then, I know I'm digressing, 40 years later when they invent Google, I put in that professor's name because I wonder what happened to her. And she was in jail in Florida. And I went down and got her out. We're still friends. We still speak to each other every week. But she was the only one back then who really came to my aid from that personal stuff. But as I said, I developed the ability to be a tough cookie. So I do think that was something that I needed in life. So, all right, so now, what do you have a question? Now we're up to 73. I want to also get to CBST.
Yeah, no, we will. So, just to remind mentioned that you had been attacked other times and also raped. Was that part of your experience as a young?
Yeah, it's in my memoirs, The Book of Rick, Part 1. Um, well, the first time I was beaten was in Allenhurst. Second time I was beaten was in 73. Then I had a little mugging at Rutgers, and then these holes in my hand were from a bad fad bashing in the 1980s. And then the rapes were all date rapes. The first one was a police officer in Buffalo. Still remember his first name, don't remember his last name. I wasn't into heavy sex, and I couldn't really get into the bars, so I used to meet people in the parking lot behindhand, and he lived right nearby, so we went home. I was expecting just to get to first base, and he wanted to hit a home run, and I didn't want that, so he took out a gun, and it was not a pleasant evening. But then again, I couldn't say anything because he was a police officer, so I bucked up and never really dealt with that one. And then later, in Rutgers, so this is my third master's, so we're talking about between 75 and 77, I went to the usual bar that I went to, and then I met someone there, and they said, let's go to an after-hour place, which I've never done before. So we went to the Anvil on 14th Street by the West Side Highway, and that was the first time I ever did poppers. And I just did not feel right to be able to drive a car to go to my parents' house that next morning. So he said, why don't you just stay over on the couch and take a nap, and then you can go in the next morning. And then again, also, he wanted to do things that I didn't want to do, but I banged on the wall and screamed, and the neighbors called the police. So then the police came. I didn't press charges. And they drove me back to where I left my car. That's where I learned that in Manhattan, the intersection of Greenwich and Bank, there are two. There's Greenwich Avenue and there's Greenwich Street. So they drove me back to the intersection of Greenwich Avenue and Bank, and I start crying, my car is stolen. It's not here, I don't understand. And I said, wait a minute. They not only stole my car, they stole the brownstone that I parked it in front of. And that's when the police officer said, oh, you're the other Greenwich. And they drove. So I got my car, and then I went home. And then again, my mother was cleaning the basement floor, because that's what she did when she was nervous, because I came home late. I was supposed to be, see, what I used to do is I went to Rutgers. I would go to Manhattan at night and then take a nap in the car, and then be at my parents' house at 8 in the morning. But this time I didn't show up right away. So that's why, again, when people talk about Me Too and stuff like that, and date rape and all, there is a missing component. There are some nasty men who not only abuse women, but there are nasty men who abuse other men, especially, again, I was 115 pounds and 5'2". Now, too heavy, I'll sit on it. I can defend myself, I guess, better. But, so those are also parts of growing up as a gay man in the 1970s. But now I want to get to a very important year. So 1973. So before I was beaten up and graduated was Passover and spring break. So we're talking about April of 73. So I go home for Passover. And my mother comes up to me with a little clipping that she took out of the newspaper. And she goes, remember when you said you wanted a gay synagogue for the Torah and I said you were crazy? There's a gay synagogue. Here, go to shul. So it was on that Friday, and I look it up now on the computer. It was April 20th, which happens to be Hitler's birthday. In 1973 was the first time I went to the Church of the Holy Apostles. I still remember where I parked my car. I still remember I couldn't find it because it wasn't the big church. It was in this building next to it. And I went in, and again, there were nothing but old men. They were in their upper 20s and 30s. Maybe even one was 40. And it was in a little daycare center space. So they had these tiny little like yellow plastic chairs. So I didn't want to deal with them all the way in the front. I sat sort of in the back, and I sat on one of these tiny little yellow chairs. My tuchus was still small enough to fit in. And I listened to the service and everything, and then when it was finished, I didn't even really want to go speak with them. I just went home and I said to my mother, "Why do you send me to a synagogue with nothing but a bunch of old men?" So that was my first time going to CBST, and as a result, I am able to say I was there in April. Saul Mizrahi was there on February 9th, the first night, but I was only like a month or two behind. But then I went back to college, obviously, and then a year or two later, or so, when I moved back from Rutgers and I moved to the city, so in the later 70s, I start going back to CBST. But by that time, we're in Bethune Street in the Village, and there's probably 100 members, and I think dues was $25. So I started getting acquainted again with CBST. But CBST has really been a major component in my life. I mean, I've been there from the beginning, and through our era where we were the only place really that had a space at Bethune Street. So that gets us to 1979, which is another very important year. This is right after Anita Bryant is doing all of her shtick in Florida, and people are saying that, you know, teachers can't teach, and that hit me personally, because that teacher, the one who got me the protective order, she was running Communicative Creativity, which was a program for learning disability and disabled children. And she would take 100 college students and 100 kids, and your curriculum for 4 credit was that kid. You dealt with their family. I went to St. Mary's School for the Deaf, you know, whatever your student was. And I got my master's degree in curriculum development, and I did my student teaching, and I worked with BOCES, and I was her assistant director until the president of the university called me in and said, "We hear you're openly gay." And I said, like, "You hear? I'm in the student newspaper, you know. It ain't you hear." So he goes, "Well, we're afraid parents might complain, an openly gay person dealing with children." So I said, like, you know, hello, I'm like 21 years old. I'm attracted to older men. I'm not attracted to younger men. So he says, "You can't teach her anymore." So getting my master's degree, the first one in education, didn't do anything. So that's why I then went into civil engineering, and then I used my master's degree to write the curriculum and charter for the College of Urban Studies, because that's what I became interested in. And then I went to Rutgers for a master's in city and regional planning. So now I digress so much that I forgot what we were talking about.
So this is really interesting. So your teaching experience, all that was in Buffalo in the early 70s?
I stayed in Buffalo until 1974. I got my first master's, first two masters in Buffalo. And then, as I said, I started the College of Urban Studies, and one of my friends who was also teaching there, because we had these after the riots in '69, the students created the college system. And there was like Rachel Carson College, C.P. Snow College, College Z, College F, College A. And then when Rockefeller became the vice president, Malcolm Wilson became the governor. And he said, "I'm getting rid of all of these student colleges unless they get accredited." So I was in the socio-engineering program of the civil engineering department. And the first semester I was a teaching assistant in Fortran. Do loops. And then they came to me and they said, "You got a master's in education, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah." They said, "Can you write the charter and the curriculum and get it accredited, and let's create a College of Urban Studies?" And I said, "Great, that's really what I was going into civil engineering for," but they didn't have an urban planning program. So I took parts of College Z and Rachel Carson and CP, whatever it is, and we put it together, because I do remember that William Kunstler was teaching a class on Attica. And again, I couldn't be a lawyer yet. New York State, it was the Onofre decision in Western New York in 1980 that said sodomy was no longer a crime. So I still couldn't go to law school. But I gave William Kunstler his check to teach his class at Attica. And my friend Barry Gettleman, now Barry is short like me. His mother, you might have heard of her. Estelle Gettleman, you might know her as Estelle Geddes. You ever watch The Golden Girls?
I might be the only person who never watched it.
Sophia Petrillo from The Golden Girls was Barry's mother.
Oh, wow.
So Barry and I were in that program together, and Barry and I are still friends. So, so that was how I did all of that, and then I could go to any college I wanted to for urban planning. You know, when you put down on your resume, I started the first College of Urban Studies, and they made me the director. So I was the director of the College of Urban Studies in 1974-ish. So I applied to Rutgers. I got accepted. I got accepted all over, but I didn't like NYU. It wasn't a good school at that time. And Columbia was like scary neighborhood. I didn't want to go to Harvard and those places because it's still, and U of P, and all of these places, they accepted me, but Rutgers was a state school and it gave me full scholarship. And you could drive from New Brunswick or Highland Park, where I was staying, to the city in like nothing, an hour or so, I guess it was. So I went to Rutgers for 2 more years. And then instead of getting my PhD, I said, oh God, I'm sick of school. I'm like, this is 1977, so I'm 25 years old. I'm old already. So I decided to stop school and go for a job.
And were you active in sort of gay rights work, sort of post-college, post the Gay Liberation Front?
Well, I never hit post-college because then I worked at NYU for 20 years and I still teach. So I'm not out of school yet. But no, again, it's beshert. I go to Rutgers, to New Brunswick. The bar I go to is called Manny's Den. I live in Highland Park on Raritan Avenue. Right down the block is Dick Mack. He owns Manny's Den. His father was Manny, Emmanuel. So that was where I hung out all the time. Matter of fact, he gave me my graduation party in his backyard. So he also has passed away since. So I hung out at that bar so much, but I was never on physical staff. I never got paid. I did have a T-shirt that said beers only on the back. So I would hang out there all the time, and if it got really crowded, I could be like a bar back and help out if it was really crowded. And then I got to know Dick Mack, and he says to me once, he says, do you know that this bar went to the Supreme Court of New Jersey to allow gay people to congregate with a liquor license? So although everyone knows about Stonewall and like June 28th, 1969, and the mafia-owned establishment, and that people would be busted and all because gays could congregate. If they ever look at the Supreme Court of New Jersey case of 1967, the lawyer's name was Meth, M-E-T-H, and the Managing Society gave an amicus curiae brief for it. And if you read it, it's hysterical. It's like the man's pinky was raised, or they looked at each other too long, but it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in '67, the Supreme Court ruled that the liquor authorities couldn't close down a gay bar because gay people were congregating there. So again, I had all of this history, and of course, I always, whichever school I was in, if there was an LGBT organization, I either was in it or I helped start it. I think at Rutgers I started RAPS, the Rutgers Association of Planning Students, and it still exists now. So yeah, there has not really been a time in my life. In my Jewish summer camp, I organized the waiters, and on Visitors' Day, I threatened to go on strike unless they met our demands. As I said, in Hebrew school, I went on the bus to see Bobby Kennedy for Soviet Jewry. So I have an entire, so as I said, come '79, we decide we want to march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. Albany was just for gay rights. So I was part of the original group that decided we were going to try to do this. At that time, the National Gay Task Force was not supporting us. So they said we needed a space to hold an election, to vote on should we have the march and who should be the organizers. So I called up, at that time, the president, my friend, at CBST and said, can we use it on a Sunday? I'll open it, I'll close it, I'll clean it up, everything will be fine. He said yes. So, mimeograph machines, putting up posters on lampposts. I even went to the Duchess, they wouldn't let me in so I finally found a woman who would take my flyers and put them inside the Duchess so that they would come. And then we finally were going to have that meeting on that Sunday, and then that Friday, another member of the board calls me up and says, I just did a telephone board meeting, we reversed the decision, you can't have the meeting on Sunday. So I said, okay, and I did it anyway. And then he called me up and yelled at me so that I quit the shul for about 10 years.
Why was he opposed to you having the meeting?
The verbal discussion that he gave me was that he was afraid they would lose their tax-exempt status if they did anything political. I wasn't a lawyer at the time, but I said, did you ever hear Martin Luther King? I said, you can do things that are political without endorsing people. And that I said, I'm sorry, I just thought you were wrong, and I didn't think it was right for you to do a telephone board meeting. And I did it, it's done, and we voted. The real reason, I think, is because he didn't get elected to nothing. I can't remember everyone, but Stephen Alt was like a national. Ron Altheim, I think, was national. Betty Santoro was national, and Ron and Betty are both dead. Steve's out of the country. Eleanor Cooper, I think, might have also been national or New York State. She also passed away. Juanita Ramos and me, and I think two other people. I know I was state. I was the New York State representative for the march. So that guy was very upset. If he wasn't involved in something, he throughout my lifetime, he didn't like that I brought the Torah here because he got a Torah from Kladno, which was considered the Holocaust Torah. And although my grandpa's Torah survived the Holocaust, he was afraid there was like competition. So I don't want to put in a historical document. I didn't even mention his name. But it was an issue. But as a result, we did have the meeting in New York, and then I think I also had a meeting in Philadelphia that we went to, and then we flew to Houston, Texas, where that was the meeting now where the rest of the country, we wanted something in the middle. And well, how we got to that point was also very interesting for history's sake. How do you do a national march when you've never been out of the city? So there was a book called Bob Damron's Bar Guide. And it was on something called paper. I don't know if young kids even know about these things. We didn't have Google that you could look up a website. You bought the book. And then each state would have down where the bars were, where the hotels were, where restaurants were. You turn pages. So one of the unions, I think, allowed us, there was something called a tie line, where if you wanted to use a telephone at night for free, they were paying for it in bulk by month. So they would say to you, yeah, you can come after 5 o'clock to our offices and use our phones for free. So me, 5 or 6 other people, we would go there with our guides, and we would call up Montana, Big Joe's Bar. So I call up, of course there's a time difference and whatever, and someone answers the phone. I go, hello, who's this? This is Joe. Oh, okay. I'm Rick Landman. I'm calling from the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights in October. And would you like to be the Montana representative? He goes, you're calling a payphone in front of the bathroom. I go, that doesn't matter. We reached you. Do you think it would be able, if I give you my number, can we keep in touch? Can you get 5 or 10 people together? And this is how it started growing, that the rest of the country became involved. And I think almost every state did send somebody to the March on Washington in 1979. But then in Texas was our final time where we're going to do all the final details. And the New York and the California group of people, we've been to gay bars, we were going to do the work. So we were called the All-Night Coalition, or Caucus, All-Night Caucus. And the rest of the country, we called them the Hinterlands Caucus. Now, they went to Montrose Street to bars, and they went for dinner, and they did all this other type of stuff. We stayed, and it was at the campus of the University of Houston. They gave us the dorm. It was a democratic state in a democratic city, and the mayor actually of Houston came and spoke at this meeting and let us for free use his dorm in the middle of the summertime. So we strategized out everything. L was going to come before G. It was the National March for Lesbian and Gay Rights. And we were deciding, and the women were going to march, and all of these type of things. They wanted gender parity, not gender equity, in that it meant that if you had 4, at least 2 had to be women, but all 4 could be women. There were all these things I didn't, but we didn't sleep that night. We didn't go out that night. We had the whole thing worked out. So then the next morning when we have our plenary sessions and everything, and I still remember one of the guys from down south, we knew Robert's Rules of Order, and we were all bouncing back and forth and getting our agenda done, as they were all tired, hungover. And then one guy got up and said something like, I object that it's unfair that you have a 2-minute limit on what I can say, and I can't say in 2 minutes what that guy over there can get out in 30 seconds. And then I said, out of order, he's beyond his time limit. So it was really, there was sort of, but we did it. We got it all put together, and we got all of the stuff. And again, this is still without the National Gay Task Force. They kept on saying things like we wouldn't be able to know how much toilet paper to order. And we all kept on looking at each other saying, like, how many people here in this room put on another march for either for women or for Vietnam or for something? I said, why can't we do it? So it got done. So that's, again, now you know the history of the Hinterland Caucus and the All Nights Caucus.
So, and the task force was against it because of the logistics?
Again, when one looks at history, no one knows. It could also be it was a thing of turf war. They were in Washington, and they were supposed to be doing top-down, you give us donations and we'll take care of the politics for you. And then here a group of people that started with a little circle of people from New York, and then people from California, people from, I remember Eric from Massachusetts, and getting together and saying that we now are going to put on a national march on Washington. We're going to choose the speakers, we're going to organize it, and we're going to get it done. And they felt out of it. They did, I think like 2 weeks before at the end, they did come in and they did acknowledge us or whatever. So, but again, CBST had a lot to do with that, in that it was our space that held that meeting. And the other thing, just I want from history, people have to realize that Congregation Bet Simchas Torah, CBST, not only as a congregation, but the individual members. Just like me, I'm an individual member of the congregation. Mel Rosen, who was one of the presidents of CBST, was one of the founders of GMHC during the AIDS epidemic. We've lost about 150 members out of 400 members to AIDS at that time. Irving Cooperberg, who was also a president of CBST, but when the city of New York was selling the old former Food and Maritime High School building at 208 West 13th Street, the mayor said it either goes to auction, or if they can come up with the deposit, we'll give a purchase money mortgage, but they have to come up with $500,000, and then we'll let it go through a local development corporation from the borough president's office, and it won't have to go to auction. Irving, in those few weeks, raised the $500,000. So, and then he became on the board of the community center. And now Judge Marcy Khan, she did the legal paperwork to help get from the other side. I was the executive director of real estate development under Mayor Koch, but I quit my job right before this thing happened so that there was no conflict of interest. But again, all of these things, so many people from this congregation have been involved in so many things beyond the Jewish community and beyond into the LGBTQS community. We now put S down because about 15% of our congregation is straight.
Oh, that's interesting.
We don't discriminate, especially the young children. We're not sure yet.
So it's interesting also because.
Sorry, we're just going to change media.
Oh, sure.
Oh, okay.
So what I was asking was, what did the day of the march actually feel like in 1979?
And as I was saying, there's something about me where I go into remote control in order to get things done. And then the next day afterwards, I say, oh my God, I don't, I don't feel. So like at my bar mitzvah, I know I got up there and I sang and I did my stuff, but I emotionally was not there. And through much of my life, when I am put on that spot to do the stuff, I do it, I perform it, and then afterwards, this also means funerals, I get through it. It is only now that I'm like retired and not as nervous that I'm more in the present when I'm feeling. Because I asked myself also, what do I remember from the first March on Albany? It was cold. And it was the first time I saw a woman urinate standing up next to me in the bathroom. And when I saw the movie Cabaret, I cracked up laughing because I said, that happened to me too in Albany, because it was my first transgender person who I knew, but it was such a mess with the bathrooms and everything that if like someone really has to go, and there's a long line there and there's no line there, you go where you have to. So what do I remember from the first march? And again, I've been to other of the marches. The first one, we were just busy. It was always, yes, I do remember we walked around. I did do that, but then you always have to you're standing where the speakers are, and you're either working with the press or you're working with making sure, where the hell is she? She's supposed to be up there in 5 minutes speaking. Will you go get her? So I've always been a schlepper, a runner, and getting the thing done that I'm not really feeling and enjoying. That is something that I haven't really experienced that often in my life, in the present tense. I'm either in the future tense planning it out, and then the next day thinking about it. But that was the first one. Then I think it's the third one, when they opened up the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington on the same day. So we went down from CBST, and we did the March on Washington, and then we went to the opening of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where now over 1,500 photographs, letters, and artifacts I have donated from my family are there. But a very strange thing happened that night. So I was there, and I met the head archivist, who was an Orthodox Jewish person. Oops, this is being recorded, so I don't know. I may not actually, in order to keep his privacy, I won't say anything, but there was a lot of coincidences that happened, and as a result, he did go to my Jewish summer camp, and he was very helpful when my dad, in 1995, when he turned 75, had a heart attack, and he survived in the hospital. He says, Ricky, remember I told you not to go in the basement in the back room there, that there was a lion? So I said, Dad, I've known since high school. There's no lion in that room. He says, but did you ever go in and look what's there? So I said, no, you told me not to go in. I've never gone. He goes, now is the time. So when he gets home from the hospital, we go downstairs to the basement, and we go into the back room, and we open it up, and there's all these boxes, and I never looked inside. He says, take one down. So we took it down. Now, Dad was 18 when he was arrested on Kristallnacht and went to Dachau. And then because of quirks beyond today's taping, my grandfather is able to get out, and then my father can get a temporary transit visa to London, and then from London to New York, and then join the United States Army, go through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Anzio, France, and liberates Dachau, and is the first American into his hometown of Augsburg because they asked for a jeep to see if his family was alive. So towards the end of the war, they used him, just like Henry Kissinger, who's David and Elizabeth's father that my mother was friendly with. That whole group of German Jewish refugees were very helpful at the end of the war because they spoke fluent German. So my father would be interrogating, say, an SS man, and they would take out photographs from their Leica cameras of the most atrocious pictures of a bullet just hitting the skull or whatever tremendously horrific things, and they would trade them like trading cards. So when my father would say to his Colonel Porter, what should I do with this stuff? Yeah, throw it out. He didn't throw anything out. He took everything, anything that had a swastika on it dealing with Jews, because when he left Dachau, they made you sign a postcard that basically said, had a wonderful time, the food was great, they didn't mistreat me, and they said, if you ever say anything against us, we will find you no matter where you are. So he had a special drive to find anything that was Jewish and relating to the Holocaust, except they didn't call it the Holocaust back then. So he sent it to his mother, and she would keep it all. So we had boxes of this. So when I called up the archivist, he came to Queens and he went through, and to this day, we're still not through all the boxes yet. So a lot of the stuff, especially the photo albums, my father wanted to keep because as his memory and the dementia started, this he knew and was comfortable with. As I told you earlier, he was a soccer player. And he was on the Augsburg Jewish team that would be playing the Munich Jewish team. And someone in one of the museums found a photograph of the soccer team, and they emailed it to me. So I said to my father, Dad, they want to know who are the names. Do you remember the names? So my father goes, sure. Fritz Müller, Hans, and this one is Walter. Walter's cousin was sleeping with this one's sister, and he knew all of these people. So we gave all that information, but then, as I said, he says, I'm getting hungry now, let's have lunch. And I go, lunch? It's time for dinner. What did we have for lunch? So my father could remember the names of the 1937 soccer team, but he couldn't remember if he had lunch. So I didn't want to give some of the stuff to the museum because he enjoyed going downstairs and going through this. And some of the stuff, again, this one is a digression from LGBT, but when I said, how come no one's coming to my bar mitzvah, and my father pulled out a suitcase, I'm not 100% sure if this is the same suitcase. But when he went to Augsburg as the liberator, and he's driving the Jeep, and he went to his house, the woman who answered the door was a neighbor. And of course, he's wearing an army uniform with his rifle, and at first they're intimidated, and then they go, Heinzchen? So they go, one moment, your aunt left this suitcase. Your cousin, the daughter, went on the Kindertransport to London. So she couldn't send a letter for real, but she would write letters, and she took family pictures and kept it in a suitcase and said, if anyone ever comes back from the Landman family, please give it to them. So when my father's there, he goes, I'm still in the middle of a war. I can't take a suitcase with me. But someone one day will get it. So when he married my mother and my mother's father he would go to Germany every summer. He was the one that picked up the suitcase. So it could be that's the suitcase that's still in the basement that, I didn't give it away to the museum or anything because for me, it has all of the stories of my family sort of put into one. And that photograph it's still in the suitcase, is the photograph when my father gets to London at the age of 18 on April 15th of 1939. He doesn't speak English. He's not yet an enemy alien. That comes in September. But he goes to the lawyer who got him out of Dachau and filled out the paperwork to get him the temporary transit visa. And he walks to the lawyer and he finds him, and the lawyer goes, I don't speak German. But my father spoke Yiddish because his father, the one that was born in Russia, that got the visa to come to America, is from Anatevka land in Fiddler on the Roof and was able to speak Yiddish. So my father spoke Yiddish. So he said, the lawyer said, my wife's parents speak Yiddish and they'll be at the dinner. So they have dinner, and then my father takes that picture and shows it, and the lawyer's wife's parents say, nicht gut, something's wrong here. And he goes, what? He goes, those two people don't live in Augsburg, they live in Munich. So my father goes, you're right, but how do you know that my grandparents, this was the wedding picture, live in Munich? So they said, when we were fleeing Poland, you had to get through Germany to get to England, we stayed at your grandparents' house. So they turned to the lawyer and they said, you get him the equivalent of like a green card and you get him to America. So that man's name was Charles Auken, the attorney. Well, years later, in 1996, Sir Ian McKellen gives money to the Stonewall Foundation to hold a seminar on what happened to the homosexual community during the Third Reich. And Jack Gilbert asked me to come over and speak because I started the International Association of Lesbian and Gay Children of Holocaust Survivors because they wouldn't allow openly gay people to be in Holocaust groups because they said we're doing what Hitler didn't do, we're not having children, we're devils, we're gay, we're against the Torah and all this other crap. So I go to London and I look up in the phone book, Charles Auken's name is there. He's dead, but I speak to his wife, and his wife says, my son is in theater. Well, another 10 years go by, and I'm watching Mrs. Henderson Presents, and it says, David Auken. So I look up on Google, he went to law school. So I track him down, he's the son of Charles Auken. So I tell him the whole story about everything, and he goes, where do you live? So I said, in Manhattan. He goes, oh, maybe you know my son Daniel Auken. He's the artistic director of the Soho Repertory Theater. So I call him up the next day, and we have lunch together. So I said, we should make a book or a movie. We should fall in love and get married because of our families. He goes, one problem. He goes, what? My wife and kids in Brooklyn wouldn't understand this. I go, you're not gay? You're an artistic director of the Soho Repertory. He says, I said, I didn't know there were straight people. But now there's a play on Broadway that he's involved in, and I'm still, when my book is totally finished, I'm going to go bring him a copy because his family story is in it, and then it'd be hysterical if they turn it into a movie because then his whole family can help with the executive. Oh, and also, when I called up Auken on the phone the first time, he calls me back and he goes, you were in London, you spoke. I go, yeah. He goes, well, Martin Sherman, who wrote Bent, he goes, I was the executive producer of it. And I go, Martin Sherman remembers me? He said, yeah, you were the comic relief. We all remember you. Because what happened was, well, Martin Sherman wrote Bent, and I did see that. So, but when they invited me, they made a mistake. They thought I started a group of children of lesbian and gay Holocaust survivors. No. I have lesbian and gay children of Holocaust survivors. So when they introduced me as the leader of the new organization of children of lesbian and gay Holocaust survivors. And I had to get up, and this was all televised with the BBC and this whole, and I go, excuse me, do you think Fritz and Morris fell in love, in Sachsenhausen or something and had a child? I said, no. I said, oh my God, and you paid for my trip. Am I going to have to pay to go home by myself? But I'm the child of two Jewish Holocaust survivors, and I happen to be gay. So everyone cracked up laughing on that thing. So that's how I remembered that. All right, do you have any questions?
That's a very good story. So I want to ask you, as you know, it's about to be the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, and Obama declared the bar and the park in front of it a national monument in 2016. And so when you think about that, does that bring up memories for you or thoughts about your own path? Or what it's been to be gay sort of in this era?
Well, that's three different things. I also, by the way, I was at the events and whatever, and I was also on the landmarks committee when the whole district was landmarked, and then this was a special thing that we had an individual designation on the Stonewall bar. But putting on this, to me, over the 50 years, one, it went by very quickly. I still don't feel that like I'm old. But I also helped I was the marshal for the 45th anniversary of the GLF people. So right now there's a bigger conflict that's going on. It's the old conflict of is it a parade or is it a march? And that we've had those arguments in the past. But now it's because next year is the 50th anniversary and it's worldwide. And the police and everyone are saying we have to restrain the route. We have to have a garbage truck on every street and a police officer. And so right now I'm sort of laying low because the meetings that they've been having at the center on Tuesdays, and I'm here on Tuesday nights because I've been taking a class. So yes, of course I don't like the commercialization. I preferred when we ran up 6th Avenue, there were no floats. We had signs, but that was it, and it was the political message. And then I'd been to, except all but 3. So I've been to like 47 of the marches. And I've seen how at first it was just, again, like the politics of police abuse and struggling for gay rights. And then came the 80s where it became almost like a memorial march where we were really crying when they would have 2-minute type of moments of silence. And then, at CBST and everything, we would try to either carry people's names and remember all of our friends who were dying of AIDS. And then also the anger against the Reagan administration and how nothing was being done and ACT UP and all. So that was all in the 80s. So, and then it would change again in the 90s. And then, so now again, I'm for all inclusiveness. So yeah, if you want to dance without your shirts on and have a bar float, that doesn't bother me. And again, if a corporate entity wants to pay the money and have a float, doesn't bother me. But what the problem is that I still think it should be a march and not a parade. And we really should be focusing on the backward march that this government is now doing to try to remove as many of the rights to the LGBT community that they have. So it's very common, they say, well, we get our money from the TV showing of it, and that's because the corporate entities want their floats to be on the TV as like a free commercial, and we need all this money to pay for the insurance and to pay for the police, and in 2018, that's the reality. This isn't. So I see everyone's side to it, but I'm hoping that we come up with a better solution. As I said, last year, this current one, so it was a different route, and it wasn't as long, but it still went on for 9 hours. So I don't, as I said, for the event, to me, it's a commemoration of a rebellion or a riot where police were abusing people. It also it really should be more inclusive in that history includes everybody who was involved there. And it wasn't only on one night. It wasn't only people who were inside the Stonewall. It was also people who were outside the Stonewall. And then the people inside the Stonewall, yes, like my friend, they just had to show their ID and leave. Of course, people of color and people who are street people were going to be abused more by the police. Their experience is going to be different than my friends who would then get outside and was screaming and outside from in front of the building. And then you also need bureaucrat people like me who sit down and fill out forms and get insurance and do these type of things. A movement is everybody. And just as an aside, when you were talking about I think they should take the statue of Sheridan, who is now in Christopher Street Park, and move him around the corner to Sheridan Square and put him there. And I think that they should get a new and a different, they can leave George Siegel's statue. I have a personal attachment to it. One of those men I befriended at the exact time period when he was telling me how they smeared him up with plaster and put straws in his nose. So I know one of those people, of the models. And then I was at the community board meeting that night when they voted on it. And I didn't realize how much my voice carries, but I think I was like either it was at St. Vincent's Hospital, Cronin Auditorium, and some woman got up and said, "You can't put that in public, it's pornographic, that man has an erection." So I said to the person next to me, but it carried, I said, "Oh, that's so-and-so. I know so-and-so, and believe me, that's no erection." And everyone heard it and cracked up laughing. And then the vote carried, finally, because it didn't carry the other times. So I always say to myself that little statue have a little personal thing, but it was never meant to be in that location. It was a duplicate from the Mariposa Foundation, I think, out in California, and we had a hard time trying to figure out where to put it. So yes, it is very white, but maybe they could make another statue and put it where Sheridan is now to continue to show the inclusivity of the LGBTQ, fluid, bisexual. I call myself now post-binary. I don't know what the hell's going on. And the older I get, the easier it is to not understand anything. But so anyway, so that would be one of my suggestions, is to move Sheridan, because I don't think Sheridan belongs in Christopher Street Park.
Is there anything you want to tell me before we say goodbye?
Well, I mean, it dovetails to I'm amazed how fast 50 years have gone. I mean, I'm assuming that next year, or in 2 years, I'll be going back to Buffalo as the old sage of the person who founded the Gay Liberation Front at the University of Buffalo. For several years, I was really nervous that the state government was going to cut back on their funding. So on my own, I created a scholarship, and I gave cash to the Student Association to then give to whoever would become the president of the University of Buffalo. I think they called it the LGBT Student Alliance or something. And I would actually make a little certificate signing it from the founder to Tina something Foot or something. I remember some of their names. But just to keep it going so that they would have money in case the state cut it off. And now, as I said, 50 years have gone by from the time, I mean, in a way, it was sort of like a maternal or paternal instinct. I figured, hey, we started this thing. I don't want to just have it dissolve. So I'm assuming I'll go back for the 50th anniversary in 2 years. That would be 1970, so it's 2020. But history is very important. And it's amazing, when George Santayana said, if you don't study history, it repeats itself. I think what we're learning now is that there are some people intentionally studying the negative aspects of propaganda and big lie theory of history in order to try to make it repeat itself in a way that, as an American whose family and country fought against Nazism, makes me very upset. So, I mean, I'm participating in so many of these history type of things, and from both perspectives, the Jewish perspective, refugee perspective, and LGBT perspective, because if we don't learn history, it can repeat itself in terrible ways. And as a German, Jewish, gay person, I used to joke when I would say, I don't know which one they would have come for to pick me up first. Would they have waited till Kristallnacht and picked me up in November 9th of 1938? Or would the Nazis pick me up in 33 or 34 for being an LGBT activist? So it is a very scary time that we're in right now. And it is such a confusing time in that I'm also the one who did the inscription of the 5 stones in the Sheepshead Bay Holocaust Memorial Park, to the stones for what happened to the homosexual community, the Sinti, Roma, Gypsy community, the disabled community. And that took 25 years to get done. And I still haven't gotten the city to be able to officially acknowledge it and recognize it, but the stones are out there.
Can you tell me about that? I don't know about that.
So when Mayor Koch was mayor and the city of New York decided to use city-owned property, make a city-owned park, and call it the Holocaust Memorial Park in Sheepshead Bay. And it had about 240 stones. And those stones were either to inscribe names of people who died in your family, or to tell the story of the Holocaust. But it was only from a Jewish perspective. So the original designer, George Vilanikis, who worked for the city for the Parks Department, he included 10 stones for other victims besides the Jewish community. And it was supposed to be dedicated to all the victims of the Nazi era. But the Orthodox Jews in that area, they felt that, quote, it was demoralizing or degrading the memory of Jews to mention if homosexuals were killed in the same sort of way and have them memorialized. So every year I would ask to have, for first what happened was I said to my dad and his relatives that I am now inscribing the 17 members of our family. And I think it was $180 a name. So I had a few of the names put in. And then this woman who was in charge called me up once and she says, "Oh, this is so sweet of what you're doing. Why don't you come to my house for Shabbos dinner and everything?" And then she says, "And if you hear any rumors about this homosexual stuff, forget about it. Poo, 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 it's never going to happen." So I said, "Oi, poo, 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 I'm homosexual. It's going to happen." So it almost became a personal thing that every year I would apply for my International Association of Lesbian, Gay Children of Holocaust Survivors and CBST. And every year it would be rejected. We're talking about 20 years. So finally, I retire, and I'm a land use attorney. And I was on the community board. I was the chair of the Landmarks, the Tribeca, and the planning committee of Community Board 1, and I was on Board 2 for a while too. So I said, this is, you can't do this anymore. You know, I said, now that I'm retired, I'm going to sue you. You can't hide behind the community's local group and say, Commissioner of Parks Department, that you're not going to do this. I'll go to the Human Rights Commission, mandamus, there must be something I could sue you with. So by coincidence, there was a mayor at that time who wanted to speak at CBST for our Gay Pride Shabbat service. So got hold of the people and I said, you know something, I stand in front of CBST's door every Shabbos for decades. I think I'm going to make a flyer and hand it out saying that the mayor will not approve the inscription of the other markers for Sheepshead Bay. So within a week, I got a phone call. Yeah. The mayor is going to set up a blue ribbon panel under the commissioner, and who have the power to override that local community group that has rejected you every year. And if the blue ribbon panel agrees that it should be done, it will be done. So he gave his speech. I then filled out all the forms. I had to contact the Holocaust Museum in Washington to get the wording fixed, and unfortunately the Roma Center community does not like their wording. Hopefully one day they can have it amended. But then I couldn't find anyone to inscribe it, and there was no more money left for inscriptions. So everyone I contacted said, who was Jewish, if we do it, we'll never get any tombstones to inscribe. So I found a non-Jewish, non-local area person who was willing to do it for free. So then, how do you get it done without demonstrations? So I put on my kippah, and I went in the morning and I marked it all. I said, we're fixing up and cleaning up the park for the high holidays. So we came in, we did all the inscriptions, and then left, and no one knew about it. And then again, the city didn't acknowledge it. So a year later, I, from just CBST, created my own little program, and I invited one Jehovah Witness who was in one of the camps. I invited the disabled community, the Roma and Sinti and everyone, and we did our own little private unveiling of the stones. Unfortunately, it was the day that that woman's husband died. And at the funeral, someone got up and said that I was doing this. They said, everyone en masse, let's go from the funeral. Let's go and demonstrate. And then the man running for city council, who is Russian, he also put up banners and stuff like that. But I had a permit that I paid for legally to be able to use that park that day. He did not. So he was violating the law, but they had a counter demonstration while I was trying to, again, get to the memories and to the feeling of what this is supposed to be. He lost. He's not the city councilman for the area. But I'm still trying, if you go on my website, I would like the de Blasio administration to just acknowledge it, have a 1 hour program out there, because this is one of the few places in America where there's an outdoor public inscribed in stone memorial to tell the story of what happened to the homosexual community in the Nazi era and the disabled and the Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's part of the entire park, but as I said, no one knows about it. So, which is also, and we'll end this probably, this is one of the personal chuckles I get. So people say to me, like, do you go to Broadway shows? Do you go to cruises? Right now, I take care of my mom, I took care of my dad, I don't really travel. But they ask, what's your hobby? I don't play baseball, I don't play basketball. My hobby is changing the world, but in ways that sometimes nobody knows about it. I get chuckles even at CBST. There's certain things I might have said as a joke. Like for Micha Mocha, we always do it in the melody of a holiday that's coming up and all. So I jokingly said at Gay Pride Shabbat, why don't we do it? I think I said somewhere over the rainbow, but we do it now to I Am That I Am. But so every year when they play that melody to Micha Mocha, I laugh inside because I said, that was a joke that I made that Joyce picked up, and we do it now every year. And there are so many things in this world when I walk around, either from my job of working for the city and being on the community boards, that I go, oh yeah, they finally built that thing that we were talking about, or they finally did this thing. So part of I didn't realize all of this till I read my memoir. And I realized, I'm 66 years old, and I've been active in this for 50 years. I do feel paternalistic. I don't like what the Trumps and the people are doing. Every time I read about another provision that Obama and the lawyers put together and that now Sessions is taking apart, I take it personally. You know, it's a kind of thing. I mean, and I helped with the group of people who drafted the first domestic partnership law. Again, it started with a CBST member, Art Leonard. And then I was with the Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Rights back then. And we worked this thing out, but the joke was that this would become law before I have a date. So when they asked Dinkins when he signed the executive order and they invited me to come, I didn't have a date, so I didn't go. So, but I'm just saying, this is all of these things I think back at, and I had a little bit to do. I was not the show horse. I was always the workhorse, second and third on line, the one where people went out to party and then they'd say, here, go write this. You know, we need a PR piece. We need the insurance. We need this and we need that. And as a result, I have seen all of this stuff. And now I'm able to sit down and tell these stories. And as I said, this is only 1 hour's worth. You know, I tell stories from Bella Abzug days. I can tell stories from my family, both sides of my family, and in Germany and all this other type of stuff. So that's why for the next 30 years, eventually I will end up at CBST. It's row 13 on the aisle in Paramus. I already got a little plot there. So, but in the meantime, I'm now decided that my future is going to be in speaking engagements like with this, one-man performances. I do walking tours and history walking tours. So it's the stories that my father gave me that I got from, again, just listening while all the other people were talking, because they're dead. There are not that many people from the LGBT community who were active. I was younger that they didn't take seriously, but I was there. I mean, I may not have been the organizer of the Gay Liberation Front who ran up the 6th Avenue, but I ran behind them. So that's why I think part of what my job is now is to tell these stories. So when you said you wanted to record the story, I said I would do it. So I guess that's a wrap.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a wrap.